Today, I'm going to talk about how to transfer your printed embroidery pattern onto a piece of fabric. So I have printed this off from my computer, and the first thing I always want to do is cut off any extraneous text or printing that I don't actually want to end up on my fabric. The reason for this is, especially if I'm going to be doing something with a heat transfer with an iron, sometimes printer ink can accidentally get transferred onto fabric. So begin by making sure you've cut all this extra stuff away so that all you're left with is the actual marks you want to end up on your fabric. The first way to do this, and probably the easiest and cheapest method, is to use a simple number 2 pencil and a light box. You can purchase a light box for crafting purposes at your average craft store or online. But if you don't have a light box and don't want to spend the money on one, you can use instead a computer screen or a tablet. Here I'm actually using my iPad. Or you can even use a window on a sunny day. So what you would do is you would begin by putting your pattern face up on your lit computer screen, your light box, or if it's a window, obviously then it would be vertical. So you would take a couple pieces of tape and put a piece of tape there and there up in the top 2 corners and tape it to your window. Then you would take your fabric and put that face up over your pattern. Now I'm going to turn off my background light here. Sometimes doing this in a slightly darker room makes it a little bit easier to see what you're doing. So now, because of the light coming from my tablet screen, I can now see the pattern through my fabric. And then all I'm going to do is take my pencil and very lightly begin to draw my pattern like that. So then, if I take this up and pick it up, you'll see that now that pencil mark is right on my fabric. So that is one way to get that pattern onto your fabric. If you are using a computer or a tablet, one thing I will caution against is you don't want to do anything that is going to actually damage your valuable piece of machinery. Here on my tablet, I have a screen protector covering this. And I also make sure that when I use my pencil, I have taken some time beforehand with a piece of paper. And I've really just kind of done this. Just scribbled a little bit, and that helps to dull that point just a little bit to make sure I'm not accidentally scratching my tablet. And then as I'm drawing, I press down very, very lightly. I don't want to dent my screen. With the second method that we can do, you would still need a light box, but this time you could use something called a heat transfer pen. These come in a variety of colors. So I have here one in orange. I also have blue, red, green. They come in black. And these are sold by a variety of different companies. Some are thinner and thicker than others. The brand I personally like to use is this one made by a company called Sublime Stitching. I like this one because I think they have a very nice fine point that I haven't been able to find in other brands. The pens do not leak. They write very cleanly. They don't dry out on me. And when I use my iron to transfer these to fabric, it works well. I'm not paid to promote these or anything. I just think these are a good set of pens that are worth the investment. So anyway, you can pick your color based on the color of your fabric and maybe the color of the embroidery thread you're going to be using. And so here I'll use my blue. And in this case, because you're going to be making an iron-on transfer, you need your transfer to actually be a mirror image. So I'm going to take this now, my printed pattern, and I'm going to flip it upside down onto my light box. And then all I do is I take my transfer pen, and on the back of the paper, I simply trace the embroidery drawing like that. And then as I continue to trace this whole thing, what will end up happening is I will have created an iron-on transfer for myself. Over here, I will show you I have a completed one that I have finished of a different pattern. In this case, I had a pattern that required different colors to help me as a stitching guide. And this is a case where the iron-on transfer pens are sometimes a little more useful than simply using a pencil. So you'll see here I've done part of my pattern in a dark blue and part of it in an orange. So then when that gets ironed onto my fabric, I have those nice colors right on my fabric to use as a color guide. Now here I have a small little test swatch that I'm going to do for demonstration purposes. Notice I've used my heat transfer pen to write the word in mirror image, because once that's turned over and ironed on, it will end up appearing right side on my actual fabric. I position it exactly where I want the pattern to be on my fabric, and then I secure it in place with a couple of pins. Now it's important that your pins do not go over where your actual pattern is, because that will affect the ink's ability to transfer onto the actual fabric. I like to use 2 pins right at the top. I like to use 2 instead of just 1, because that keeps this from slipping out of place. You don't want to accidentally have kind of an out of focus transfer where you have part of your pattern here and part of it over here and doubled up lines and things like that. But I also like to put my pins only at the top, because that way, as I'm ironing, I can actually lift this up to peek and make sure the ink has transferred the way I like. And if it has not, I can feel confident that it will drop right back down exactly into the same space. So now I'm going to go and I'm going to use my iron, and I'm just going to press my iron on top of this on a medium setting of heat with no steam. Make sure your steam is off, and I'll do that for about 30 seconds. I'm back now and I have used my iron, and now if I zoom in here a little bit, you'll see when I lift this up how that transfer has happened right onto the fabric the way I want it to. So now I can pull my pins out and take this off, and there is my pattern right on my fabric. Keep in mind with these pens that this is permanent ink, so you do want to make sure that any marks that you are transferring onto your fabric will end up being covered by your embroidery. You don't want to make any notes or arrows or anything out here that's not going to get covered, because that will, that could end up ruining your project. So that is the heat transfer pen method. Last but not least, what do you do when you have a darker fabric or a fabric with a lot of texture to it? So with these pens here and with the pencil method, this would not work if I was trying to do this onto a dark purple or a black fabric or something like that. And also, it wouldn't really work if I was trying to work onto a velvet or a terry cloth, like a towel material. So with those sort of tricky fabrics and tricky colors, this third method is what's going to be the way to go. Now this particular fabric I decided to do a project on, you'll see, is a very dark black. This would be a difficult fabric because of its color to be able to transfer a pattern onto. So what I use in a case like this is something called water soluble stabilizer. And so as I move this over, you'll see I have this laid over on top of my fabric, and it's just this kind of almost saran wrap looking, maybe a little bit thicker plastic material that I have secured down onto my fabric just with some safety pins. So I put this down. And when you have this, what you can do is you can start, before you attach it to your fabric, you could take your, well here, let's take my test pattern here, for example. Let's say I had this. You could just put it underneath your water-soluble stabilizer, and then you can literally just take a Sharpie, just take a permanent marker, and you can draw directly on it. And you can draw anything you want. You can draw marks. You don't need to worry about stuff that's going to accidentally leave permanent marks on your fabric or anything like that. Then, once you've done that, you get rid of your paper. You pin the stabilizer to your fabric, and then you can stitch straight through the stabilizer and the fabric, as you'll see I have done here with this moon that I've worked on. And when I am done with all of my stitching, all I have to do is take all of my fabric with its stabilizer, take the pins out of it, and I put the entire thing in a big sink full of water. And I let it sit there for a little while. And this plastic is just going to dissolve away completely in the water. So all I'm going to be left with is my fabric and my stitch work. So like I said, this works great with these darker colored fabrics, or if you have something like a terry cloth towel where the texture of the material is difficult to stitch through, and it's just a difficult sort of material to put your, to draw a pattern onto, this is where the water-soluble stabilizer can be very, very useful. Now, the downside to it, in my opinion, is just how noisy it is, to be honest. So if you ever want to go embroidering somewhere where you're supposed to be quiet in a corner, keep this in mind. That's what you're going to sound like. It's like the candy wrapper being unwrapped in a quiet theater sort of problem. So if you need to embroider somewhere quiet, it might be better to use that easier and lighter colored fabrics with the other two methods. Otherwise, these are the three, in my opinion, best ways to get your pattern onto your fabric.